22 years have now passed since Laci Peterson was murdered while 8 months pregnant with her son. He was getting ready to run. He had cell phones, credit cards. It played out like a real-life soap opera in people's living rooms. When a case stays in the headlines for more than 2 decades, most people assume the story has already been settled and every question already answered. That's exactly what happened with the Laci Peterson case. Most people believed it was closed, the truth long since established. But new developments in 2026 have pulled one of America's most talked-about criminal cases back into the spotlight, surfacing details that have surprised even people who followed it from the start. An ordinary young couple in Modesto. Laci Peterson was 27 and 8 months pregnant with her first child when the winter of 2002 settled over Modesto, California. She and her husband, Scott, had built what looked like a hopeful, ordinary life in a modest house on Covina Avenue. Friends and family remembered Laci as warm and already deep into planning for the son they'd named Connor. Scott sold fertilizer for a living, and by all appearances the couple was moving through late pregnancy with the usual mix of excitement and everyday routine. On the morning of December 24th, Scott later told police he'd left the house between 9:30 and 10 to drive alone to the Berkeley Marina and fish in San Francisco Bay near Brooks Island. When he came home that afternoon, Laci was gone, and their golden retriever, Mackenzie, was found wandering outside with the leash still attached. Within hours, it was a national story. News trucks lined the neighborhood, and cable coverage turned every small update into nightly drama that gripped millions of viewers. Scott's affair with massage therapist Amber Fry surfaced almost immediately. He told her he was a widower spending his first holiday alone. That revelation flipped public opinion overnight. A husband who'd been cheating while his pregnant wife disappeared looked guilty to anyone watching from home, and the investigation seemed to move in lockstep with that assumption. Prosecutors eventually built their case around the idea that Scott killed Laci inside the house, moved her body to the marina, and dumped her from his recently purchased 14-foot boat so the remains would vanish into the bay. No blood, tissue, or DNA consistent with a violent killing was ever recovered from the house, the truck, or the boat. The only physical connection between Laci and the boat was 2 strands of hair found under a seat. Concrete anchors Scott had mixed became a key piece of the state's narrative, even though jurors were never shown direct proof those anchors had actually been attached to a body. Coverage grew so intense that once the public had settled on Scott as the only possible suspect, every competing theory quietly fell out of official focus, and the case hardened around a single version of events that would hold for the next 22 years. Even so, a separate set of voices was trying to be heard the entire time. The neighbors who said they saw her walking. In the days right after Laci disappeared, more than a dozen people called police or the tip line saying they'd seen a pregnant woman walking a golden retriever around East La Loma Park or the surrounding streets that same December 24th morning. Several of those sightings were reported to have happened after Scott said he'd already left for the marina. Witnesses including Tony Freitas, Martha Aguilar, Jean Pedrioli, and John Brazil each described a woman with short dark hair matching Laci's appearance, struggling to keep control of the dog. The overlapping details, location, timing, the dog's behavior, made the cluster of reports hard to write off as coincidence or wishful thinking. A mail carrier who delivered to the Peterson home between 10:35 and 10:55 that morning later said the gate was open and the usually vocal dog was silent, a detail that lined up with the other accounts. Detective Nanette Espy has said any missing person case requires investigators to run down leads like these, since even a single credible sighting after Scott left the house would have cleared him within 48 hours. Instead, those tips were largely set aside. Investigators never systematically walked witnesses back through the exact locations, or treated the cluster of sightings as a potential alibi worth confirming or ruling out through careful follow-up. None of those witnesses meaningfully testified at trial. The possibility that Laci was still alive and out walking her dog after Scott drove off simply dropped out of the official story the public and the jury ultimately accepted. It's not hard to imagine the quiet frustration those callers carried for years afterward, believing they'd seen a living, pregnant woman in broad daylight while the official response treated their accounts as unreliable or simply beside the point. Setting those sightings aside did more than dismiss individual statements. It closed off an entire line of investigation at the exact moment the truth may still have been within reach. And while those neighborhood voices went unheard, another crime was unfolding just steps from the Petersons' front door. The burglary across the street. Directly across Covina Avenue, the Medina family left home around 10:30 that same morning for a short trip to Southern California. When they got back on December 26th, they found their house had been broken into. A safe, jewelry, guns, and tools were missing. Two men, Stephen Todd and Donald Glenn Pierce, were later arrested, and both told police the burglary happened on the 26th, after Laci had already been reported missing. But multiple neighbors reported seeing a suspicious van and men at the Medina property on the 24th itself. One account described men carrying a safe out of the house. A confidential informant, and later jailhouse conversations, claimed Laci had interrupted the burglary in progress and threatened to call police. On the morning of December 25th, a stolen van turned up fully engulfed in flames about a mile away, behind the home of a relative of Todd's. Inside the burned-out vehicle was a mattress that tested presumptively positive for blood, with a gasket sitting on part of it, which ironically kept that section from being destroyed entirely. Fire investigator Brian Spitulski said the blaze looked intentional, designed to erase evidence. Defense attorney Mark Garagos has said key details about the van and mattress were never turned over to the defense as they came in, and that later lab testing looked at only a small swatch of fabric rather than the whole item. Months after Laci vanished, investigators on the missing person case and the burglary case met and agreed to destroy what remained of the Medina evidence. Prosecutors maintained there was no connection, and that the break-in happened after Laci was already gone. Destroying physical evidence while a murder investigation was still open left a gap that's never been fully explained. And it's worth sitting with how differently things might have unfolded if the van and mattress had been treated as a possible link instead of a coincidence. Those questions have only grown heavier over time, and they lead directly to the forensic science that once seemed to anchor the prosecution's entire theory. The currents that started telling a different story. At trial, hydrologist Ralph Chung told jurors that wind and current data were consistent with a body placed south of Brooks Island, right where Scott said he'd been fishing, testimony that traced a path from Scott's boat to where Laci's remains eventually surfaced on the Richmond shoreline months later. Years afterward, experts working with the Los Angeles Innocence Project ran the numbers again using Delft 3D hydrodynamic modeling, a tool that simply didn't exist in any usable form back at the original trial. The new simulations found that where Laci's and Connor's remains were actually recovered didn't line up with the dump site at the fishing spot Scott described. The modeling instead pointed towards shallower water near the Albany Bulb or somewhere reachable by land, much closer to where the bodies were found. Separately, testing the jury never saw involved throwing a weighted dummy built to match Laci's late pregnancy weight off the same style of 14-foot aluminum boat, and the boat became dangerously unstable, nearly capsizing in some attempts. Only 2 strands of hair ever tied Laci to that boat, and no blood or tissue was ever recovered from the boat, the truck, or the house, despite the violence the prosecution described to jurors. Attorney Chris Pixley has argued the original expert testimony fit neatly with the state's theory, but rested on assumptions modern computational tools now significantly undercut. Once the physical path of the body stops leading back to where Scott said he was fishing, the whole sequence jurors accepted needs a second look. The water itself, in a sense, has become a witness the original trial never got to hear from using tools that exist now. The growth charts that move the clock forward. The state's timeline leaned heavily on testimony from Dr. Gregory DeVore, who used 1990s-era fetal biometry charts and a single femur measurement to place Connor's death around December 23, 2002, a narrow window that tied the killings directly to the hours before Scott left the house and made every later development look like confirmation of the state's theory. Specialists who've since reviewed the same measurements against modern standards reached a notably different conclusion. Data from the Intergrowth 21st study, published in 2014, along with WHO and niche growth charts, place Connor's most likely date of death somewhere between December 28, 2002 and early January 2003. A Harvard radiologist retained by the Innocence Project put the central estimate near January 1st, and forensic anthropologist Allison Galloway, who examined the remains at autopsy, had actually given a range stretching as late January when she testified originally. Since a fetus can't survive long after the mother's death, a later date for Connor implies Laci was alive for days after Scott's fishing trip. Experts like Dr. Ronald Wapner have pointed out that without knowing an individual fetus's precise growth rate, any single measurement only supports a statistical range, not the tight, convenient window the jury was given. The science available in 2004 simply couldn't support the level of precision prosecutors asked jurors to treat as settled fact. And if both mother and child were still alive after Scott left Modesto, the total absence of forensic evidence anywhere becomes a much bigger problem for the state's theory than it first appeared, one that keeps widening with every new study and every fresh expert review. The choices that looked like guilt. The prosecution's version required Scott to kill Laci inside the house, move her body through it, load her into the truck, drive to the marina, transfer everything into the boat, and dispose of the body in the bay, all without leaving behind any biological trace beyond 2 strands of hair. His behavior after his arrest at a San Diego golf course, dyed hair, his brother's ID, a large amount of cash, new camping gear, was presented to the jury as obvious evidence of a guilty conscience. Defense voices, including Pixley and Nanette Tusby, have argued that a man facing a media-fueled presumption of guilt and real death threats might reasonably try to disappear regardless of guilt, simply because his hometown had already decided his fate. Garagos has said it was the affair itself, not any physical evidence, that ultimately convinced the public and the jury. A forensic document examiner who reviewed handwritten notes from the home found them consistent with Laci already knowing about the boat and even shopping for marine gear herself, which complicates the idea that Scott bought the boat in total secrecy purely to dispose of a body. The near-total absence of physical evidence anywhere the crime supposedly happened sits alongside behavior that can reasonably be read more than one way, depending on what you already assume about the case. The long road to 2026. The Los Angeles Innocence Project, which first said publicly in early 2024 that it was investigating Scott's claim of innocence, formally laid out these arguments in a habeas corpus petition filed in August 2025, arguing his conviction rested on false and outdated forensic evidence, and asking the court to weigh the new science and the long set-aside leads. On April 27, 2026, Superior Court Judge Elizabeth Hill declined to review the new evidence and denied every one of the petition's roughly 14 claims, ruling them either procedurally barred or without legal merit. Stanislaus County's District Attorney's Office pushed back hard, noting Peterson has raised similar claims of new evidence more than a dozen times since his conviction. LAPD Deputy Director Hannah Brown said the organization strongly disagreed with the ruling, calling it a misapplication of habeas corpus law, and confirmed the group would appeal to a higher court, with the California Supreme Court as the next stop and, potentially, the U.S. Supreme Court after that. Laci's mother, Sharon Rocha, has publicly rejected the entire premise, saying flatly that no genuine new evidence exists. Separately, Peterson also has a juror misconduct claim still pending before the California Supreme Court, after a 2022 evidentiary hearing found that one juror gave false answers on her jury questionnaire, though the court ruled at the time those false answers weren't intentional and didn't prejudice the outcome. Attorney Chris Pixley continues to argue the original verdict rests on unreliable scientific testimony that can't meet constitutional standards, and Mark Garagos has said repeatedly that he's never believed Scott capable of these particular crimes. None of this has produced a clean resolution for anyone involved. What it has produced is a clearer picture of how a legal system can become so committed to its first conclusion that new evidence starts to look like a threat to that conclusion rather than a chance to correct it. Whatever the truth, the record now shows several independent lines of inquiry: the neighborhood sightings, the burglary evidence, the current modeling, the fetal growth data that were either never fully tested at the time or were actively closed off by decisions made early in the investigation. That tension between institutional finality and the discomfort of reopening a settled case may be the part of this story that outlasts every filing and every documentary revisiting it, including the one that aired in July 2026 and helped push these questions back into public view rather than let them stay buried under 2 decades of certainty. Whatever the appellate courts ultimately decide, the underlying problem doesn't go away on its own. An investigation that closes doors quickly and a system that keeps those doors closed for decades leaves everyone touched by the case in a state of unresolved tension. Laci and Connor's family continues to carry their grief. Scott Peterson continues to insist he's innocent from prison, and the public keeps wondering whether the full truth was ever really allowed to surface. That tension is what keeps this story feeling unfinished more than 22 years later, and what keeps the questions alive long after the news cameras moved on to other things. What do you make of the new science and the leads that never got chased down? Share your thoughts in the comments, and let me know whether you think this case deserves another day in court.